Hi, everybody. I don't have any slides, so but my name is Kirk Hamilton. If that's, that's probably what it would have said over there. So pretend it says Kirk Hamilton. He's not a jerk. Hi, everyone. My name's Kirk. I totally screwed up the first line of my talk by saying my name already. I exist mostly on the internet, and I have lots of opinions about video games. I'm features editor at Kotaku.com, where I've been for almost 3 years now, which sounds crazy when I say it out loud. Before that, I was the games editor at Paste. I have also written things for the New York Times, Edge Magazine, The Border House, Killscreen, and a bunch of other places. Today, like everyone else, I want to talk about how we talk about video games, and that begins with a crucial question. Video games. Video games. Is it one word or is it two? Many critics and scholars have weighed in on this debate, and yet we're unable to decide once and for all what the answer should be. So today, I'd like to begin an in-depth... Wait, hang on a second here. Okay, that's totally not what my talk is about. I don't want to give a talk about that. Sorry. I was hoping that no one was actually giving a talk about that here. I'm actually sort of like that question a lot and hope we never find an answer. But no, today I'm going to be talking about how to write games criticism for a mainstream audience, which is a kind of a question I think that's worth approaching and hopefully something that I have some useful advice on. So for starters, what does that term mainstream audience mean, and what does it mean to write for them? To my mind, a mainstream audience member is someone who is smart, curious, and interested in video games. They might play a lot of games, or they might not play very many games at all. Maybe they used to play games and they don't really play them very much. Maybe they've cut them out of their life and they sometimes regret it. Maybe they can't afford to buy a lot of video games, but they remain interested in them and like to watch them online or read about them. My boss, Stephen Totillo, often describes our ideal audience member as a hypothetical acquaintance that you meet in a bar. Someone who says, hey, I've heard a lot about this game, BioShock Infinite. What's the story with that game? It's supposed to be amazing. So as you set down your drink and you prepare to launch into one diatribe or another, you also pause to think about what kind of language you'll want to use with this person. What would they understand most easily, and what would they be most interested in hearing? That person is your mainstream audience. Maybe they periodically check the New York Times or Slate or The Atlantic. Maybe they just rely on their Facebook feed for cool stories. If their web browser winds up on a gaming site, it's probably because a friend posted something interesting looking on Facebook, not because it turned up in their RSS feed. They probably don't even have an RSS feed. These are not the people who read Critical Distance every week. They're not the people who consistently track Kotaku and Gamasutra, let alone R Games or NeoGAF. The mainstream audience can be difficult to conceptualize because they're not actually all that visible or vocal. They're readers, they're not commenters. They're smart, they're open to new ideas, but they're largely uninitiated. For a long time, I was the mainstream audience. I had played video games most of my life, but I'd never really, beyond reading the odd game review, I'd never really thought that critically about them. And then one day in 2008, I happened upon Mitch Karpata's blog. I hope he's watching this. Insult Sword Fighting. So through him, I was introduced to the work of Michael Abbott, Lee Alexander, Kirk Battle, Dennis Farr, The Border House, Chris Dallin, Tim Rogers, Matt Burns, and all the rest. Wow, I said to myself. I never even realized that you could talk about video games this way. So you may be thinking, well, this is all well and good, but I don't actually want to write for a mainstream audience. Okay, that's fine. Though you should ask yourself who you do want to write for. It may well be that you don't want to write for a wide mainstream audience, or whatever you're working on isn't perfect for that. That's cool, but it is important to identify who exactly you're writing for. Because of course, the mainstream audience, it isn't the target of some, or even a lot of games criticism. Some of my favorite stuff is really, really deep dive, intense, weird stuff that, most mainstream readers, people who just read the New York Times, wouldn't really like. So I'm certainly not saying that all writing is for that. This is just how to do that. But if you've been thinking about expanding your reach in your audience, if you want to get more people to read and share your stuff, and in particular, if you want to get someone to pay you to write criticism of video games, you're going to have to tailor some of your work to a mainstream audience. So hopefully some of this advice will help. First up, jargonitis. There is a disease plaguing games criticism. I call it jargonitis, or at least that's the word I made up for this talk. Too many games critics have adopted the language of game developers without pausing to evaluate whether or not that language actually helps us accurately describe the thing we're talking about. In doing so, we're making our work echoey and impenetrable, and robbing ourselves of opportunities for self-expression and creativity. So here's an example that I wrote about Titanfall, because Titanfall is fun and everyone in the mainstream press is talking about it a lot. So here we go. Titanfall's mechanics have been polished to a mirror shine. It's great to see EA embracing a new IP, similarly to how they gave us Dead Space and Mirror's Edge back in 2008. New moves like double jumping and wall running make traversal a blast, giving the traditional Call of Duty-style Iron Sights gameplay, which developer Respawn helped invent, a welcome jolt. The game smartly iterates on other tried-and-true shooter systems as well, feeling at once familiar and new. XP unlocks and kill streaks have been tweaked to welcome new players, resulting in a remarkably successful and accessible AAA FPS. When compared to previous similar titles, EA's new release feels titanic indeed. Sorry. So that may read like a caricature, but if you check out the majority of games writing going on the internet these days, it's actually not that far from reality. Terms like IP, mechanics, the design, systems, FPS, UI, iteration, release, kill streaks, unlocks, AAA, indie, Steam, devs, shooter, platformer, roguelike. These terms can be perfectly fine when you're writing for an audience on the inside, for an audience that understands the language, but they're immediately off-putting to a mainstream reader. Now, I know that most of the people in this room are way better writers than the hack who wrote that thing about Titanfall. All the same, there isn't a single one of us, present company included, who doesn't occasionally or even frequently indulge in an outbreak of jargonitis. The key in overcoming it, and therefore the key to writing work that appeals to a broad audience, is consistently asking yourself what you're assuming about your reader. This goes beyond language and eventually encompasses topics, angles, story selection, etc. There's an old journalistic mainstay that says you're not supposed to assume knowledge on the part of your audience. That's very good advice when reporting news, but it's also useful when writing criticism. Does your audience necessarily know what a shooter is? How about a platformer? A lot of people don't know what a platformer is. Have they ever heard the term FPS or IP? Do they know what a dev is? Remember, you're at a bar, you're talking to a bright, curious acquaintance who likes video games but doesn't follow them closely. Would they have any idea what you're talking about? If the answer is no, back yourself up. Can you really need these specific terms? Can you do without them or swap something in for them? Is there some clever way you can actually describe what the term is shorthand for rather than simply inserting the shorthand and moving along? If so, it's almost always worth it to make the swap. Because here's the thing about finding alternatives. Not only will they make your work more accessible, they serve the bonus function of making your writing better. I've gone back and de-jargonized my writing more times over the last few years than I can count, and every time I do, it makes my work stronger and increases the number of people who might read it and get something out of it. I usually wind up replacing buzzwords with new, creative phrases and metaphors that are more interesting purely as writing, in addition to being useful and more specific to the thing I'm talking about. As an example of that kind of thing, here's Lee Alexander discussing the level layout and combat design of BioShock Infinite in an essay she wrote last year. I really like this essay, this excerpt. The game's grasp on level design seems limited to Super Bowl Sunday arenas and a repeating paradigm of twin staircases looping up to some higher platform. Men yell at me from uncertain directions, sounding distant, and yet suddenly there's someone behind me. I don't know who he is or where he came from, but I open his skull like a reflex. Not more than 2 hours in, I had seen the waxen inside of tens of anonymous skulls without having any reason to invest in any of them. I enter an area, the swarm begins. All sentiment but tension, tedium, they all dissipate in the onslaught. I am desperate for the sharp violin note that tells me it's over. I will hear that note countless times and feel nothing but mechanical, empty relief. Given the technical nature of what Lee was talking about, she could so easily have lapsed into jargonitis, using buzzwords like lackluster AI and repetitive level design and illogical enemy spawns. Instead, she conjures the game's often thrown together feeling combat with a unique sort of clarity, and while she does assume some prior knowledge of the game on the part of her reader, her language assumes very little advanced knowledge of game design terminology or jargon. Anyone with a passing familiarity of BioShock Infinite could read that excerpt and understand something essential about the game. As a result, her full essay could be published just about anywhere. At Kotaku, we often try to write for the broadest audience possible. Sometimes that gets us in trouble. But more often than not, it helps us relentlessly increase and diversify our scope, and it keeps us perpetually pushing to be the best, most inclusive and accessible site we've ever been. Lots of you probably know about our parent company, Gawker Media's fixation on traffic. But sometimes the particulars of our traffic obsession get lost in the discussion. Yes, we're traffic obsessed, but not all traffic is created equal for us. We're focused on getting new readers, which means somebody, new IP that hasn't visited the site in 30 days. As a result, it's in our best interest not to preach to our existing readers and commenters, but to write articles that reach beyond them and attract fresh eyeballs to our work. Now, I've been at Kotaku long enough that I've probably drunk some of the Gawker Media Kool-Aid, so bear that in mind. But I think that the way that we track unique visitors is a very solid motivator that results in good, accessible work. It keeps our work broadly interesting and lets us choose stories that a large number of people actually care about. Because of that, it helps us drive the conversation on the most relevant and interesting topics of the moment. One of the most critical things I learned early in my tenure at Kotaku was that it never pays to write for other games critics, nor does it pay to write for games developers. No one really wants to read that, because when it comes down to it, games developers and game critics, they make up a very tiny percentage of your potential readership. Yet, everybody kind of writes for other game critics, at least a little bit. We write for one another, and through our writing, we motivate one another to be better. And that's great. That's healthy. But if you want to write something that's accessible to a broad audience, you've got to write for them and not write for other critics. It's crucially important that we do this because, in my opinion anyways, getting your work read by a large number of smart, curious people, that's one of the main reasons this whole thing is worth doing. When we write about games, there's often an element of advocacy to it, of evangelizing. But it's a very specific type of advocacy. When I write for a mainstream audience, I'm not advocating for video games. Video games don't need my advocacy. They're doing just fine without me. Rather, I'm advocating for critical thought about video games. It may seem a fine distinction, but it's a crucial one. The internet can provide a great stage upon which to introduce newcomers to the world of games criticism, forever adding to our thoughtful inertia, spinning the conversation up and up, helping us to better understand games, art, the world, and ourselves. It's a place where we can make thousands, even millions of people say the same thing I said back in 2008. Wow, I had never realized that you could talk about video games this way. Thank you.